Fred.
When I was 12, I had what the doctor incorrectly labeled as a terminal inoperable cancer. And the first procedure by which they discovered that was as humiliating a medical procedure as a 12-and-a-half-year-old boy could possibly go through. And raised in a good atheist home, and I don't mean that with any irony, I mean a good atheist home, I had this vision with my eyes of Moses and the children of Israel going through the split sea. Being that I was a good atheist, that passed. It turns out that the terminal sentence was a bit of an exaggeration. So I recovered. The disease came back twice. I've survived it thus far, although I'm a rabbi, so there is some long-term consequence that's debilitating. I was a chaplain at Sloan Kettering, walked into someone's room, and she said, looking at this little 25-year-old kid, you know, what the hell can you possibly say to me? You've never had cancer. And I blurted out, I did too, which was the first time I ever consciously was aware that I had had cancer, even though I had gone to cancer wards and whatever. My point here is that mystical experience did not make me a believer. I didn't have a thing to put it on until I became a believer for other reasons. And then I remembered it and went, oh yeah, there was something there. So the challenge I would like to make is I think that in some important way, we really need to become allies. If you'd like to see me as a psychologist, and I need you to write a short note to my mother before the evening is out, because that will please her no end. You know, I also want to say that I think that that kind of militant literalism is equally offensive and problematic on both sides. I don't recognize myself, and I will say here in this audience that neither Rabbi Wolpe nor I are marginal to the religious experience of the Jewish community here. So that may be both good news and bad news for you. It means you actually have what I think of as secular religious people who are your allies in everything except for the finish line, and that may hurt book sales.
Well, it's to some degree an artifact of Judaism. This is not a problem that Christopher and I run into with evangelicals and Muslims. I mean, it is conceivable to be a Jew and be even and a serious Jew, someone who takes their Judaism very seriously, and be even less religious than you are, and to say you don't believe in God, and that is just a frank contradiction within Christianity and Islam at the moment, and it was a frank contradiction certainly at some point in Judaism, and certainly Maimonides seemed to think it was. I think we can concede, however, that that belief in the afterlife, or at least a profession of belief in the afterlife, gives you something to say in the most difficult moments in life to others who are losing someone or who have lost someone. It gives you something to say that an atheist doesn't have, which, if believed by the one who has just lost their child, for instance, is really consoling. I mean, there is nothing better in terms of consolation than to believe that the child you just lost is now someplace perfect and you will be reunited.
Sam, what would you say? I mean, put yourself on the spot. If somebody in that moment asked you, I'm about to die, what's going to happen to me? What would you tell them?
Well, I mean, I think actually this issue of the one who dies is less... Our fear of death, at least as far as I can tell from a sample of one, is not of our own death. And we all go to sleep every night and just disappear. We lose everything. I mean, deep sleep for almost everyone is synonymous with oblivion. I mean, you lose your sensory experience, you forget your life. If you never woke up, you wouldn't notice it. And this is... Many people have noticed this. The perhaps most famously the Roman poet Lucretius. If death is synonymous with non-existence, there really is nothing to fear, and slipping into it may feel just as satisfying as slipping into sleep. I mean, there's just that's not what we're worried about. We're worried about the process of dying, perhaps, I mean, the process of being ill and in pain, and we're really worried about losing the people we love while we're alive and having nothing to think that's consoling in the midst of that bereavement.
I'm really glad to have the chance to disagree with you.
Right.
The problem is quite other. I mean, half my sex life has been lived when I was unconscious. More than half.
What do you mean? You're talking about dreams?
And not all of that was nightmare either, which is a thing that really does oppress and distress a lot of people, and which is as real to them as waking.
No, I wasn't talking about dreams. I was talking about deep sleep.
No, well, deep sleep.
You have to hold the mic close.
Deep sleep is where they come from, and this is why Hamlet is so well remembered, because when he speaks of the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, and he says, I can almost do it, who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the pangs of disprized love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes, if he himself could his quietus make with the bare bodkin. And then he says, because in that sleep of death, what dreams might come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil. When I speak about annihilation and extinction, I mean just that. I mean, the screen goes blank and that's it.
Right.
That's surely what makes people frightened.
Well, don't you think Lucretius had a point when he talked about...
You're not going to know you're dead, but when you're alive and you're in deep sleep, you can.
Okay, yeah. But, you know, Hamlet says the exact opposite. He says, makes us bear those ills we have, yes, rather than fly to others we know not of. Right. In other words, over there are going to be ills too. In other words, there is an afterlife.
Okay, but you're still talking about... I just want to put him on the afterlife side.
Well, his father's just come back from the afterlife.
So it's clear. All right, so...
Though he still wants some evidence in the next three scenes that was...
But can we... I have just
not an apparition.
Since I want to be peaceful about this,
yes,
can we all agree that whether there's an afterlife or not, the point of life is to live in such a way that you deserve one?
Well, that would be true if there was no God.
I did my best.
Which I've already postulated. There could be no God and an afterlife, or an afterlife and no God. If there is a dictator who distributes reward and punishment, then you can never be sure if you're doing a right action or an action born out of fear, or the hope of reward. So no, it's an incitement in a way to immorality, certainly to servility, which is not a moral position to be occupied. No.
I think we're talking slightly at cross purposes here. I'm talking about unconsciousness, just the absolute cessation of any kind of experience. If the prototypical atheist is right, and you just get a dial tone at death, that is what people claim to fear, but as Lucretius pointed out, that is analogous to the time before your birth. You'll no more suffer the eternity after your death than you'll suffer the time before your birth. And there was a time where we're sitting was populated entirely by, I think, Chumash Indians. None of us were here. Okay, now what was that like? Not for the Chumash, for us. It didn't bother me.
I was a princess. I was a princess centurion.
Go ahead, Christopher.
On this question of your rabbinical authority, I'd also like to concede, because I would say that someone who says there's no afterlife has said they're not a Christian or a Muslim. And I have found it harder to make that sort of blanket remark about Judaism, even with Rambam's stipulation. It's not an optional thing. It's one of the things it's a mandatory belief. And even with your concession that when you were directly asked, do you expect to see your grandmother again, and you did what very few Jews will do and say, well, she's only metaphorical. I was once asked by the Spertus Institute in Chicago, which is the Jewish university, to give a talk on the question, do Jews have a gene for atheism? And I speculated. The majority of you seem to be yes. I mean, Jews do not make the mistake of saying the Messiah has already come, the crass mistake of saying that. Rambam himself says he will come, but he may tarry. No other religion does this. What's the name for a heretic in Hebrew? Epicurean. They teach people all the pitfalls of Greek philosophy and Hellenism, inviting them to discover the joys of sane. And ever since Spinoza, it seems to me that the Jewish people who probably ought to be doing this, because it was their fault to invent monotheism in the first place, have become the first to transcend it. It can't be coincidence, can it? Just like people say it can't be coincidence so many Jews win the Nobel Prize. I'm serious. Spinoza, Marx, Freud, Einstein, it goes on. And it does seem to be latent in the Jewish demand to ask questions.
Yes, except
so I'm very happy. It's much more of a pleasure to debate.
Maurice Samuel, who is a Jewish writer and thinker, said that the reason that the Jews continue to exist is that they refused to quit this world until they figured out what it was about.
Yes. And Leo Strauss says, very seriously, he said the purpose of the Jews is to show there's no such thing as redemption.
The challenge here is, again...
The pathetic Christian illusions are not worth entertaining.
You're invoking, I think, a name that for me suggests something very different. Spinoza called himself God-intoxicated. And it is true that the God with whom he was intoxicated was very different than the literal God of the Bible, although he read the Bible as a political tract that had great relevance for his own time. He used it as a call for freedoms that his own community couldn't see or couldn't understand, and he had a notion of an afterlife. Again, very different than the kind of literalist read that I've heard of, but there is a tradition that goes back to the Talmud as well of rejecting that kind of literalism. Look, the whole rabbinic way of doing midrash, of reading biblical stories against the grain and filling in silences or creating extra, it wouldn't make sense if fundamentalism was the Jewish norm. And I also want to here stand up for the Buddhist traditions, which also talk about an afterlife, but in ways that some Western monotheists would find profoundly disconcerting. But there's a much broader notion, and I think it gets back to what Rabbi Wolpe said, that the notion that there is a meaning which we are capable of discovering, and that it's larger than, although embedded in our cultures, and that we have the capacity to live our lives in harmony with that. Look, for me, that comes in part out of evolution. Our brains have been 14 billion years in the development. Why would we not also trust the intuitions that we live in a universe that's moving towards greater complexity and greater relationship and greater connection?
Thanks.
It's basically Facebook is what we're talking about here. So.
Is there an afterlife on Facebook? Right. We have to wrap up, but I actually just had one small question, which is, Christopher, how are you feeling?
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for asking. Well, I'm dying, but so are you. And it gives me the chance, thank you again, to repair what would otherwise have been an ungenerous omission when I was talking about the hateful attitude of so many religious people to sick people. I have had, very involved in my care, a great American, Francis Collins, who's the head of the National Institutes of Health, and who's helped me sequence my genome amazingly, and possibly find a cure for an individualized mutation from which I suffer. Francis is one of the most devout believers I've ever met. In fact, I'm lucky to be his friend because of the religion debate. He's a very sincere and devout Christian, and all he does is say he won't pray for me. And all he does is say he's never seen in his entire medical career anything that he would describe as a miracle cure. And on that, we have one of the nicest armed truces it's ever been my pleasure to observe.
Thank you. That just proves debates like this could be life-saving.
But the short answer is it's a bit early to say. But who can't say that? No one's ever more than a breath away from the end. And we're born into a losing struggle, and we all knew that, or we should, from the beginning. It's just that I have to think about it a bit more. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. I think I can say that for all of us.
Yes. Yeah,
thank you very much. Thank you to the AJU. There you go.
Yeah, you liberals are slippery as fish.